Beast, Rapunzel, The Little Mermaid, Cinderella. We're all familiar with these Western fairy tales, at least from the Disney movies. But what about the original tales? The ones written by the Brothers Grimm, Hans Christian Andersen, Charles Perrault. How many of you know the original versions of your favorite fairy tales, and not just the sanitized Disney ones? Hello, I'm Teagan Avery, and welcome to my Masterworks presentation, titled Fairy Tales, Their Place in Our Culture and in Child Development. My presentation will consist of 4 sections. What is a fairy tale? The place of fairy tales in teaching morals to children and in child development. The controversy, benefits and consequences of reading fairy tales to children, and the modernization and sanitation of fairy tales. To begin with, what is a fairy tale? Some of the first published fairy tales can be traced back to the 18th and 19th centuries, from Charles Perrault, Hans Christian Andersen, and the Brothers Grimm. Stories have been a part of many cultures across the world for centuries, used to pass knowledge, wisdom, and even entertainment from one generation to the next. But what makes a story a fairy tale? Fairy tales tend to have some constant traits. The story takes place in a distant, unspecified past. The story is told by a storyteller. The story has a clear start and a clear ending, and there are very clearly defined heroes and villains. Generally, fairy tales share common features and nearly identical themes. For example, the prince saves the princess with true love's kiss, although they tend to vary between different cultures. Something I noticed while reading collections of fairy tales by Hans Christian Andersen and the Brothers Grimm is that many of their morals seem to be that faith in God will be rewarded. An example is The Girl Without Hands by the Brothers Grimm. In this story, the main character goes through a lot of suffering, but stays pious and is rewarded for it. The values and morals that stories stress are relevant to the customs and ways of life at the time they were written or created. Religion, back when these fairy tales were being written, was a huge part of everyone's life, and this was reflected in a lot of the stories written by fairy tale authors of that time period. Many of the fairy tales would have the main character, or characters, go through a lot of suffering, but they would keep their faith in God, and that faith would be rewarded, often by the character becoming incredibly rich or marrying a king or princess. The stories preached that no matter how much suffering you went through, if you retained your faith in God and were pious, you would be rewarded. This is an example of how stories' morals would reflect the values of their time. Fairy tales are entirely fictional and usually begin with phrases such as once upon a time or in a land far away. In fairy tales, the hero is human and often needs magical help, such as a fairy godmother, to fulfill their goals, which are usually for the hero's personal benefit. Fairy tales' original purpose was to instruct the next generation how to behave. For example, the moral of Little Red Riding Hood is to be careful about who you trust, and that not everyone is what they appear. Rumpelstiltskin cautions readers not to make rash decisions about serious issues. The story of the 3 Little Pigs shows the wisdom of working first and playing later, as well as warning that laziness has consequences. These morals are important life lessons. Parents told and still tell their children these fairy tales, to teach them about the world and to supply them with models of good moral behavior so they know how to behave in society. For centuries, fairy tales were told by word of mouth and passed on from one generation to the next, until the 16th and 17th centuries. During this time, writers such as Charles Perrault, the French author who laid down the foundations for the genre of fairy tale, best known for his tales Cendrillon, Cinderella, Michel Beauté, Puss in Boots, and Barbe Bleue, Bluebeard, published some of the first collections of Western fairy tales. Many famous fairy tale writers of the 19th century, such as the Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen, kept writing down fairy tales in order to preserve the valuable knowledge they possessed. Some of the most famous fairy tales recorded by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm include Hansel and Gretel, Snow White, Rapunzel, Sleeping Beauty, and Little Red Riding Hood, while Hans Christian Andersen is best known for his tales, The Little Mermaid, The Ugly Duckling, The Emperor's New Clothes, and The Princess and the Pea. Fairy tales are present in nearly every culture in the world, in distinct but similar forms. For example, the Northwest Coast indigenous people are heavily based on oral stories and dances. They were verbal people with no written language, so they told stories and passed them down from one generation to the next, much like people did before the Brothers Grimm and other fairy tale writers began recording Western fairy tales. Around 70% of Northwest Coast culture stories are why tales, a type of story that explains something, such as the story of Colus, which tells of a huge bird that hit the top of a mountain during a storm and rolled all the way down, to explain why nothing grew in a strip down a mountain. The other 30% or so are about something strange that was witnessed. According to Simon James, First Nation artist, many of these stories have scientific explanations. For example, the story of Colus could be explained by a lightning strike hitting the top of a mountain and causing an avalanche. With no written language, these stories were vitally important in teaching children how to live their lives and how to raise their own children. Some stories taught the children not to go into the forest at night to protect them from the real dangers of the forest, such as bears, wolves, and cougars, by telling them about terrifying creatures like Zunapa, who would steal children she found in the forest at night and roast them over a fire before eating them. Children's literature plays a key role in stimulating mind and personality development, providing young readers with mechanisms of coping with their inner problems, such as the stress and anxieties that come with life. A study conducted in Greece in 2012 states that for children, stories represent one of the most important cultural and social events of their life, functioning as instruments of socialization and acculturation. Most of the participants of the study believe that fairy tales could and should be used as instructive tools to teach their children, and valued the role fairy tales played in their children's lives. One of the couples stated that within fairy tales, their child finds a moral corrective to everyday life. All these stories represent a world in which the good is consistently rewarded and the bad is consistently punished. Another couple remarked that their child seems to realize that even in fairy tales, heroes must fight to get what they want. The findings from this study, as stated by the authors of the paper, were 1, that fairy tales are of great importance in a child's life, and 2, that most parents wholeheartedly share this view. According to the psychologists who conducted this study, the victory of good is of great importance so that children can eventually deal with their own fears. Fundamental universal values and principles, such as courage, bravery, honesty, and sincerity, can find through storytelling a safe conduct to children's souls, thus influencing their future behavior and way of life. As the psychologist said, bravery, honesty, and sincerity are universal values and traits that are all but essential in life. By introducing these values at a young age through storytelling, the children who are exposed to them learn to develop their courage and honesty and other such traits as they grow up. Current literature critics suggest that the image of a fairy tale hero corresponds to the image of the world that a child has, and hence, fairy tales represent a literary genre concerned with finding solutions and developing the self. Developing oneself is figuring out who you are, what your place in the world is. Fairy tales help people with this, especially if they've read fairy tales since a young age. In an article written by Philip Pullman in 2011, he claims that when children play at being characters they admire, doing things they value, they discover in doing so areas and depths of feeling it would be hard to reach otherwise. Exhilaration, heroism, despair, resolution, triumph, noble renunciation, sacrifice. In acting these out, they experience them in a kind of safety. Not only do fairy tales help people discover their place in the world and provide moral education, they also allow children an opportunity to develop their imaginations. What's more, exposure to fairy tales has a hand in teaching children courage and honesty, as well as in academic success. In the discussion of fairy tales and whether or not they should be part of a children's upbringing, there are two strong sides. One that thinks fairy tales are important, or at the very least helpful to child development, and that they should be read on a regular basis to children throughout their childhood, and the other side that thinks the morals and lessons of fairy tales are outdated, and/or that we shouldn't be filling children's heads with fantastic tales, that they should be raised with a more scientific, analytical mindset. Although some psychologists argue whether traditional fairy tales still have any value or interest for modern children, most acknowledge that storytelling provides not only entertainment, but also a creative way to help children form a clear picture of themselves, in order to be able to understand others and develop meaningful relationships with them. Scholar Jack David Zipes, a professor emeritus at the University of Minnesota, who has translated the Grimm fairy tales, says that they were told in different social cultural contexts as warning tales, initiation tales, celebration tales, ritual or worship tales, and so on. They could be amusing and edifying, as in providing moral or intellectual instruction, at the same time. The attitude toward children of 19th century parents was somewhat different. They didn't think children should be protected. To date, it remains unclear whether frightening stories provoke anxiety in young readers. However, according to many past studies, the punishment of evil characters is well tolerated and does not seem to have a pathological or negative effect on children. On the side that believes fairy tales are too fantastical, there is a prominent figure, Richard Dawkins. Evolutionary biologist, famed author, atheist, and former Oxford professor, Dawkins suggests children should be taught scientific rigor from an early age, and has questioned whether telling children fairy tales could be harmful, because they inculcate a view of the world which includes supernaturalism. He argues that with a tough world out there, big on massive problems, but low on fairy godmothers to resolve them, parents need to replace fairy tales with plain, honest fiction that prepares their children for a more truthful, if magic-free future. As well as Dawkins, writer Libby Copeland thinks that today's children should be shielded, and argues forcefully that Grimm-inspired tales are past their prime. She says, there's a tendency to jump to the conclusion that because modern parents are squeamish about violence, we must also be wussy and overprotective. But is it also wussy that we don't spank our children anymore, or tell them they're wicked? Many parents feel that young children are too vulnerable to be exposed to the gory, violent details from the original tales. Steve Hornsey, of the television channel Watch, gave his opinion that as adults we can see the innocence in fairy tales, but a 5-year-old with an overactive imagination could take things too literally. No parent wants to knowingly conjure up nightmares or phobias for their children, and since there's already a flood of upsetting news from war zones and natural disasters on TV screens and newspapers both in and outside of the home, parents may find cracking down on fairy tales a direct way to stem the tide. On the side that supports fairy tales, Sally Goddard Blythe, the author of books such as The Genius of Natural Childhood and The Well-Balanced Child, argues that when stories begin with expressions such as once upon a time or in a faraway land, it immediately brings to attention the fact that the events of the story do not occur in everyday life, and help the child to inquire into what is real and what is not. She also says it would be a very sanitized clinical world in which we only taught children about statistically likely scenarios. Fairy tales spark the imagination, something that isn't an optional educational add-on, but such a fundamental aspect of children's development that anything that feeds it isn't just useful, but absolutely essential. It's fairy tales' fictional way of helping children confront and overcome their deepest fears, from the dark to abandonment, that makes them so valuable, explains Charlotte Reed, head of English at First Lodge School in Berkshire. When we expose children to fairy tales, which are often surprisingly dark narratives, we are introducing them to the fact that the adult world is one fraught with dangers and difficulties. We do so, however, in the safe space of a mythical story world, and we teach them that even in terrible situations, there are solutions and resolutions. Children who listen to stories and fairy tales not only show better results in measures such as literacy tests and SATs, but also in terms of social and emotional development. Even fairy tales boost literacy. They give parents a way of gradually, and in a supportive environment, introducing children to the idea that there are bad people and a dark side to life. Furthermore, being told irrational stories does not necessarily lead to irrationality as an adult. Here's a quote from Dr. Anthony Zahetner, who runs the Teen Link Health Service for children and young people with a substance abusing parent undergoing rehabilitation treatment on fairy tales. With many broken families, disrupted lives, and unhappy children in today's society, it would be imprudent to abandon a tool which has been used for centuries to aid parent-child discourse, impart morals, and foster self-development. As Dr. Zahetner says, fairy tales help improve parent and child relationships by providing an opportunity for the parent and child to spend time together and create happy, lasting memories. To summarize, fairy tales can help children make sense of their inner and outer lives, and provide opportunities to improve parent-child relationships and create good memories that will last their whole lives. In a satirical book called Politically Correct Bedtime Stories, Modern Tales for Our Life and Times, the author, James Finn Garner, puts a modern, hilarious twist on some of the well-known Western fairy tales. Here's an example of one of the stories, Little Red Riding Hood. There was once a young person named Red Riding Hood who lived with her mother on the edge of a large wood. One day, her mother asked her to take a basket of fresh fruit and mineral water to her grandmother's house. Not because this was woman's work, mind you, but because the deed was generous and helped engender a feeling of community. Furthermore, her grandmother was not sick, but rather was in full physical and mental health, and was fully capable of taking care of herself as a mature adult. So Red Riding Hood set off with her basket through the woods. Many people believed that the forest was a foreboding and dangerous place, and never set foot in it. Red Riding Hood, however, was confident enough in her own budding sexuality that such obvious Freudian imagery did not intimidate her. On the way to Grandma's house, Red Riding Hood was accosted by a wolf, who asked her what was in her basket. She replied, "Some healthful snacks for my grandmother, who is certainly capable of taking care of herself as a mature adult." The wolf said, "You know, my dear, it isn't safe for a little girl to walk through these woods alone." Red Riding Hood said, "I find your sexist remark offensive in the extreme, but I will ignore it because of your traditional status as an outcast from society, the stress of which has caused you to develop your own, entirely valid worldview. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must be on my way." Red Riding Hood walked on along the main path, but because his status outside society had freed him from slavish adherence to linear Western-style thought, the wolf knew a quicker route to Grandma's house. He burst into the house and ate Grandma, an entirely valid course of action for a carnivore such as himself. Then, unhampered by rigid traditionalist notions of what was masculine or feminine, he put on Grandma's nightclothes and crawled into bed. Red Riding Hood entered the cottage and said, "Grandma, I've brought you some fat-free, sodium-free snacks to salute you in your role of a wise and nurturing matriarch." From the bed, the wolf said softly, "Come closer, child, so that I might see you." Red Riding Hood said, "Oh, I forgot you were as optically challenged as a bat. Grandma, what big eyes you have. They have seen much and forgiven much, my dear. Grandma, what a big nose you have. Only relatively, of course, and certainly attractive in its own way. It has smelled much and forgiven much, my dear. Grandma, what big teeth you have." The wolf said, "I am happy with who I am and what I am," and leaped out of bed. He grabbed Red Riding Hood in his claws, intent on devouring her. Red Riding Hood screamed, not out of alarm at the wolf's apparent tendency toward cross-dressing, but because of his willful invasion of her personal space. Her screams were heard by a passing woodchopper person, or log fuel technician, as he preferred to be called. When he burst into the cottage, he saw a melee and tried to intervene. But as he raised his axe, Red Riding Hood and the wolf both stopped. "And just what do you think you're doing?" asked Red Riding Hood. The woodchopper person blinked and tried to answer, but no words came to him. "Bursting in here like a Neanderthal, trusting your weapon to do your thinking for you," she exclaimed. "Sexist! Speciesist! How dare you assume that women and wolves can't solve their own problems without a man's help?" When she heard Red Riding Hood's impassioned speech, Grandma jumped out of the wolf's mouth, seized the woodchopper person's axe, and cut his head off. After this ordeal, Red Riding Hood, Grandma, and the wolf felt a certain commonality of purpose. They decided to set up an alternative household based on mutual respect and cooperation, and they lived together in the woods happily ever after. These stories have been modernized, albeit satirically, to fit our modern views. They still hold messages, but the messages have been changed. There's a cultural expectation today that everything must be politically correct and sanitized for the safety of children and to protect their innocence. As a result, the modern fairy tales many generations have grown up with are much cleaner, sweeter, and happier than the original dark stories. As each generation passes on the stories, they evolve to reflect what society deems as an appropriate story to teach life lessons and morals. By sanitizing the Brothers Grimm versions, Disney has changed the purpose to that of entertainment, while the Brothers Grimm tales were meant for education. Disney movies have their fair share of violence and dark moments. Gaston falls to his death in the animated Beauty and the Beast. So do Mother Gothel from Rapunzel and the Evil Queen from Snow White. Mulan was about war. The Evil Queen from Snow White wanted to have the huntsman cut out her stepdaughter's heart. Scar from the Lion King threw his brother off a cliff. Although Disney has kept some of the violent bits from the original tales, they have cut out a lot of the dark and gory parts of the story, not trying to impart the original morals, and change them from educational to entertaining. For example, Disney's Cinderella focuses more on the story of a beautiful, humble, and selfless girl who marries the prince, and the evil stepfamily receives no punishment for their cruel actions towards Cinderella. This version of Cinderella has been sweetened and sanitized in comparison to the Brothers Grimm tale. By changing the story, the purpose shifts slightly. The original intent of Brothers Grimm fairy tales was to teach children that if you do bad things will come to you. The purpose of Disney's Cinderella is different, because while the Grimm tale touches on revenge, on the stepsisters, and lots of violence, Disney's version tells a whimsical animated story, appropriate enough for the entire family. In the original Cinderella story, both stepsisters cut off their toes and heels so they could fit into the gold, not glass, slipper. The stepsisters were also beautiful, but with ugly hearts, instead of being ugly like Disney depicts them, and have their eyes gouged out by doves during Cinderella's wedding. Another difference in the original story is that Cinderella loses her slipper on the third night of a festival, after the prince, who has fallen in love with her, coats the steps of the palace in tar to prevent her escape. In the Brothers Grimm version of Snow White, the queen wants to eat the heart of Snow White after the huntsman kills her, and eats the heart of the boar that the huntsman kills instead. Also, the prince didn't wake Snow White with a kiss, but instead convinced the 7 dwarves to give Snow White to him in her coffin, and the dwarves let him have Snow White. As the prince's servants carried Snow White's coffin, they tripped over a tree stump, and the piece of poisonous apple that she'd bitten off came out of her throat. And then she woke up and married the prince. After the wedding, the evil queen was forced to dance in red-hot iron shoes until she dropped down dead. In the Disney version, the evil queen also dies, but in a less gruesome way. Some other differences are that instead of accidentally waking Snow White, the prince wakes her up with true love's kiss, and the queen doesn't actually want to eat Snow White's heart. In an early Brothers Grimm version, Sleeping Beauty is raped by a king while asleep and gives birth to 2 children in her sleep after he has left her. She only wakes up after one of the babies suckles on her finger and loosens a splinter from the spindle of the spinning wheel that caused her to fall asleep. When Sleeping Beauty and her children are reunited with the king, the jilted queen orders her cook to kill and feed all 3 to her husband. The cook hides them all instead. The queen's plot is foiled, and she is thrown to her death in a pit of vipers. Later versions were actually much closer to the Disney version. In the later version, there were 13 wise women in the king's kingdom, but the royal family had only 12 golden plates, so one of them was left out of the newborn princess's christening. This was a bad idea, because the 13th was furious she hadn't been invited, and cursed the princess to, when she turned 15, prick her finger with the spindle of a spinning wheel and die. The 12th wise woman changed the curse, so the princess would fall into a 100-year-long sleep instead. Another difference is that the prince found Sleeping Beauty on the day that the 100 years had ended. He did kiss her, and she did wake up when he did, but it was mostly just coincidence, not true love's kiss. The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen is a far cry from the Disney movie. In Hans Christian Andersen's version, the youngest of 6 mermaid princesses fell in love with a young prince after she saved him from a shipwreck. She went to see a sea witch, who gave her a potion to drink that would give her 2 legs, but would make every step feel like she was walking on knives. And if she didn't win the prince's heart, and he married someone else, the Little Mermaid would die the next day and turn into sea foam. The sea witch also cut out the mermaid's tongue as payment. The mermaid found the prince, and the 2 became close friends, but in the end, the prince married someone else, a girl he thought was the one who saved him from the shipwreck. The mermaid's sisters found out, and traded their hair for a way to help the mermaid. To become a mermaid again, the Little Mermaid had to kill the prince, but she couldn't do it, and threw herself into the sea, where she turned into sea foam. In the Disney movie, the sea witch doesn't literally cut out Ariel's tongue, only steals her voice, and it doesn't hurt Ariel to walk. Also, there's not the consequence of death. Ariel would only have turned back into a mermaid. And she didn't even turn back into a mermaid at the end either. She actually married the prince. The purpose of modernizing the classics is to convey the same morals and teach the same lessons, but to do so in a way that will better resonate with the audience. Using outdated stories, while still quite fascinating to some, don't always draw in everyone. With modern adaptations that show both the dark, gruesome Grimm tales and the whimsical, happy Disney versions, these morals reach audiences both old and young and tell the stories in a fresh way. Even before I began researching this topic, I was on the side of reading fairy tales to children, if only to stimulate their imagination. Although I acknowledge that it's up to the parents or guardians whether or not to include fairy tales in their children's upbringing, my opinion is unchanged. In fact, I believe even more strongly in exposing children to fairy tales. Based on the strong evidence that I found to support reading fairy tales to children, I firmly believe that it's an incredibly important aspect in a person's life, and that children who are read fairy tales benefit enormously from it. I'd like to start by thanking Jen Henriksen for organizing all of Masterworks, and for supporting me and my class throughout this process. I also want to thank my advisors, Kat Stevens, Andrea Earle, and Simon James. I wouldn't have been able to complete my Masterworks without you. I also, last but not least, I want to thank my mom and dad for their love and support throughout this project, and in your own words, Mom, not sticking your oar in and letting me have my independence. Thank you.
Okay, here's a question. Speaking towards the controversy that was brought up in your paper, one aspect of fairy tales that have been criticized by some feminists is the way that some females are portrayed as damsels in distress, requiring knights in shining armor to rescue them. Do you believe this may be a harmful message to teach young girls?
Well, as I said before, the values and themes that stories stress are relevant to the ways of life at the time they were written or created. Some of the earlier Disney movies, yes, the princesses had to rely on a man to save them. But some of the earlier ones, like Snow White, came out in 1938. So we've got to understand that things were a lot different back then. And more modern movies like Moana and Mulan and Brave and even the Tinkerbell movies, oh, and Princess and the Frog. In those movies, the main character, who is a woman, is always portrayed as more capable and stronger. So.
What an amazing presentation. That was outstanding. So comic books and graphic novels have a pretty long-standing tradition of drawing upon lore, fairy tales, legends from all kinds of different cultures. Green Arrow in the DC universe is Robin Hood. Snow Guard from the Marvel universe is based on Inuit legends. And so I was wondering what you think this tradition in comic books and graphic novels says about the impact of fairy tales and legends on adult development beyond childhood.
Yes, well, most of us have grown up with Western fairy tales, and the stories we've grown up with continue to influence us as we get older. Some artists and writers sometimes draw inspiration from fairy tales and other stories they've grown up with, like for their stories and stuff. An example is the Lunar Chronicles by Marissa Meyer. Those ones, there's a sci-fi twist on some of the Western fairy tales, but it's actually a sci-fi twist on the original Brothers Grimm tales. So.
According to my culture, a story is handed down to another by either telling the story verbally or by dancing a cultural dance based upon the same story. Do you think a person hearing the story and another person seeing the dance, but both performed by the same storyteller, will be able to retell the exact same story?
Well, everyone's interpretation is different. Even if they heard or saw the story told in the same way, it would still be different. But if they saw it, one person heard it being told, the other saw a dance, I think it would be different. The basic plot would still be there, but everyone's gonna add a little something or gloss over another little something. And I think it would be more difficult for the person who saw the dance because they can't take actual words from it to retell it. But yeah, I think the basic thing